Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Aaron Levine. I'm a senior legal and regulatory analyst here at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and I've been leading the Rapid Toolkit project across technologies for about 8 years now. Today, we're going to quickly provide just a high-level overview of the Rapid Toolkit, particularly the Hydropower Rapid Toolkit. To introduce those who are unfamiliar with the tool, but we plan on spending most of our time today focusing on a few updates. We're going to start with providing just a little high-level update on our metrics in terms of the number of report downloads and users of the tool over the last year since we last held a webinar. And then we're going to go into a number of slides providing some substantive updates in terms of the regulations that we've been focused on updating and those that we continue to track as they're going through draft rulemaking. And then finally, we're going to open it up to the audience for any questions, as well as to get any input and thoughts on what would be helpful to add to the Rapid Toolkit. With that being said, if you have questions that come up during the presentation, please put them in the chat and we will address those at the end of the presentation, or you're more than welcome to wait and raise those when we get to the Q&A section. Next slide, Ryan. So for starters, I just want to provide a high-level overview of the Rapid Toolkit itself. The Rapid Toolkit, which stands for the Regulatory and Permitting Information Desktop Toolkit, offers a solution to navigating the complex system of federal and state regulations necessary to secure project approvals. We've developed the Rapid Toolkit to this point for bulk transmission, geothermal, hydropower, and solar technologies. The project started initially back in 2012, so we're just now hitting our 10-year anniversary of Rapid with the geothermal toolkit. And then we added bulk transmission and solar in 2014 and hydropower in 2015. Next slide. So diving specifically into the Hydropower Rapid Toolkit, our Hydropower Toolkit includes 3 tools. One is our regulations and permitting database. This database includes state and federal permitting information. I believe at this point we have roughly over 20 states where we have state level information within hydropower and the Rapid Toolkit. Some of those are in the Midwestern portion of the country, focused on development of Army Corps of Engineer non-powered dams. Others have been done outside of those jurisdictions as well. We have a map on the website that you can see what states have been completed for state level regulations. And then we have the federal regulations applicable to hydropower as well. In addition to our regulations and permitting database, we also have a reference library. This is a database that we've compiled mainly of the sources that we utilize and cite throughout the individual permit process pages on the Rapid Toolkit. But you can search it as a separate database, and it's a collection of links and documents relevant to statutes, regulations, permitting guidance, agency websites, and other tools that are available. And then finally, over the years, we've developed a collection of best practice and analysis papers. We have 7 of these that have been developed specific to hydropower. They were all published as NREL technical reports, predominantly through the 2016 to 2018 range. But many of them are still helpful and useful, and we'll be talking about them briefly as well later in this presentation. Next slide. So here is that map that I was referencing. You can see the states in green these are the initial states that we had completed that have federal and state regulations applicable. These would be applicable to developing any type of non-federal hydropower project. So that includes anything relevant to a Bureau of Reclamation lease of power privilege or a FERC license or exempt project. For those states, we really took a broad purview looking at small hydropower, conduit hydropower, pump storage, whereas these states in this light blue color you can see throughout the Midwestern portions of the country are really focused on the USACE regions that have the highest potential for non-powered dam development. And so we don't have as many state level sections included within those. It's really the state regulations that would be applicable when developing an Army Corps of Engineer non-powered dam. For the remainder of these states that are just highlighted in gold, we do have the federal regulations. And as I'll get into a little later, there are some information at the state level that's been developed for other technologies within the Rapid Toolkit that are helpful to navigating those processes at the state level as well. Next slide. I also wanted to just briefly go over a couple of the features that we've built into the Rapid Toolkit over the course of development of this project. One is you can see here in the upper right portion of the screen where it's highlighted in this green box, we do have functionality built in to focus specifically on conduit, conventional, non-powered dam or pump storage hydropower development. By clicking on one of those boxes, it will gray out questions that wouldn't be applicable to that development type, and then help hone a user in on what would be applicable based off of that type of development. In addition, in the bottom left corner of this screen, I wanted to point people's attention to, there is a feature that if you sign up for an OpenAI account, you then have access to this feature called My Projects. What My Projects allows you to do is you can go through and use this as a permitting dashboard. And so from that standpoint, you can go through and star or select any of the individual permit processes or regulatory processes that would be applicable to your hydropower project, name that project, and then it allows you to have a dashboard with multiple projects, if you'd like, that you can then track which permits or approvals are applicable, keep notes on maybe where you're at status-wise and applying for those, and then once they're completed, check a box to select that they've been completed. So it does provide a light project management tool built into the Rapid Toolkit, and really it's a way hopefully to kind of bookmark and save various processes that you identify that are applicable so you don't have to go back and find them in the future. Next slide. And this here is just, if I write an animation here, this is just a little icon that you can see that when you will get to either one of these questions, identifying a permit that might apply, or if you actually get to that individual page, such as our FERC preliminary permit page, there's always this little star icon that if you click that, it will add that to your project and then allow you to select which project you'd like to add it to. Next slide. Here's just a look at our hydropower reference library that I'd mentioned. This will be broken out where you can select it by the applicable jurisdiction and topic. You can see then that you'll see a title of what the name of that entry is, the technology it's applicable to, and if it is something at a specific jurisdictional level, the applicable jurisdiction. Next slide. And then finally, this is that collection of best practice and analysis papers I was speaking to. You can see here they cover a number of topics, and I will provide a list in a subsequent slide of all of those, but they include topics such as basin-wide approaches to hydropower relicensing, case studies and considerations when going through a Bureau of Reclamation lease of power privilege process. We have one that's focused specifically on FERC settlement agreement process. And then there's another one here looking at regulatory approaches to adding capacity to existing hydropower facilities through either amendments or relicensing. Next slide. So here's that complete list. In addition to the ones on that previous slide, we've also developed ones reviewing the ILP, ALP, and TLP processes, looking at state models to incentivize and streamline small hydropower development, as well as looking at conduit hydropower, specifically energy recovery hydropower. So with that, we're looking at really kind of power in the pipes approaches to adding generation within agricultural, municipal, and wastewater facilities and other industrial water use applications. You can see that to date, these 7 publications have over 10,000 unique downloads. Of that, over the course of the last year, from when we held a webinar last summer, we've seen over 2,500 new downloads, and all of them have really been utilized to a great extent, with almost all of them except for one now having already surpassed the 1,000 download mark. So we've been really happy with the utilization of these best practices within our Rapid Toolkit. Next slide. I also just wanted to provide a high-level snapshot of our metrics, so all of you can see the extent to which the Rapid Toolkit is being utilized. Looking at calendar year 21, so going from January to December 2021, our last full year of metrics, we had approximately 4,000 hydropower users coming to the site. This page view area here, we have a number of pages throughout the website, whether they are Endangered Species Act, NEPA, or other topics that are really technology agnostic, which makes it difficult for us to track a specific technology someone is accessing that page for. So pages that are only hydropower relevant, we saw a little over 8,500 page views, whereas pages that are shared across technologies, we saw a much larger number, those ones that are technology agnostic processes, over 70,000 page views. Similarly, to date, over 13,000 users of hydropower specific content, 35,000 page views with up to 250,000 when we get into this total number. When you look at the website as a whole, that user base across the technologies that encompasses everything we can track on the website is much broader. That we saw a little over 60,000 users come to the Rapid Toolkit, viewing over 130,000, 135,000 pages in 2021, with now lifetime use up to 250,000 plus individuals have accessed the website and viewed over 500,000 pages. So certainly seeing utilization of the Rapid Toolkit across all technologies. Next slide. So with this, I'm going to kind of introduce what we had done in FY22 and then turn it over to my colleague, Jesse Carey, who's going to walk through some of the updates we made and those that we're continuing to track on the Rapid Toolkit. Annually, we go through a process of doing a detailed annual maintenance review. This one is specific to fiscal years. This is the FY22 maintenance review. We review for changes to laws, regulations, and policies, and we update them accordingly with the most current process. We also look to review and update legal citations and references for federal and state regulatory process pages, identify and update broken links. That one, is always a challenge to try to monitor and update links, but we do have some built-in automated tools in place that allow us to identify broken links very easily. Try to identify whether it's a holistic change to a website or, for example, the ECFR that we can push a broad update, or whether it is individual links that are broken that we then need to go see if that information is either no longer relevant or that link's been updated. When we update our regulatory process pages, particularly since our approach has evolved over the years, we try to increase search engine optimization that allows users to find relevant pages through Google or Bing or other search engine searches without having to directly be searching internally on the website. We've also tried to improve readability, and then make sure that any of our permitting and approval thresholds are accurate. After each page is reviewed, we do date stamp it for the current year, and so that would show, for example, current as of 2021 or 2022. So a user can at least see when we last updated that page if they're unsure whether a new regulation or statute has been included. And with that, we're gonna go ahead to the next slide, and we're gonna turn it over to Jesse Carey, who's gonna walk through some of the key updates that we made on the federal and state side, as well as those changes that we're continuing to track in our policy tracker. Jesse?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jesse Carey, and I am a markets and policy intern. I've been working closely with Aaron and Taylor and my other colleagues on the markets and policy team to track and implement a lot of the regulatory activity that's happening on RAPID, as Aaron was saying. And so some of the major changes, we're going to begin with the major changes that we have implemented, and then we're going to go to some of the areas that we're still actively tracking as those sort of proposed rules are making their way through notice and comment rulemaking, and where we're going to update them as those sort of become final. The major change that we made this year was related to the Council of Environmental Quality's rules for the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. We revised all of our federal environmental review pages. Those are the ones that revolve around federal agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, and how the NEPA process works for those agencies. We based our changes on a new CEQ rule published by under the Biden administration that eliminated or reinstated NEPA language that had previously been modified by the Trump administration CEQ rulemaking. The major ones here were basically the 2020 rule, the Biden era rule, eliminated the requirement that the purpose and need be directly staked to the applicant's needs. It further eliminated a ceiling provision prohibiting other agencies from promulgating stricter regulations than those set by the Council on Environmental Quality. And it reinstated the definition of direct, indirect, and cumulative actions within the NEPA analysis. So we went through all of our processes and made changes in conformity with that new 2020 rule. We also took the opportunity to update our pages with elements of the Trump era CEQ rulemaking that were not overturned by the 2020 rule. Most notably, the definition of major federal actions triggering the NEPA process. This is unlikely to be modified any further by the CEQ because it's literally just collecting existing federal case law on what does or does not constitute a major federal action for NEPA purposes. So we incorporated that as well. And we also took this opportunity to revise a lot of these agency pages, which are some of our oldest pages, to be a little bit more consistent with the current NREL style guidelines. So they should appear more consistent and a little bit more streamlined as we've sort of developed the House style over the years. Next slide, please. We also updated our page on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to reflect a new final rule that went into effect in December of 2021, not 2022, that revoked a previous rule clarifying that the incidental take of a migratory bird species is prohibited under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This realigns it with the longstanding interpretation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And basically just returns it to the status quo prior to the previous rule that had gone into effect. Additionally, on the Clean Water Act, Section 404, we revised our permitting page to reflect the new rule from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that basically doubled the threshold for qualifying hydropower projects to obtain nationwide permits for discharges of dredged or filled material associated with those hydropower projects from 5 megawatts up to 10 megawatts or less. Next slide. So now we're moving into the policy tracking for potential updates to federal hydropower content. One of the main ones that we're following here is the Waters of the U.S. rule. The EPA and Department of Agriculture had published a proposed rule revoking the Trump administration era final navigable waters protection rule and returned the regulatory language to the pre-2015 regulations, while at the same time also codifying recent Supreme Court cases on definitions of waters of the United States to include wetlands or other waters, adjacent to impoundments and tributaries that meet either the relatively permanent standard or the significant nexus standard. The comment period on that proposed rule ended on February 7th, 2022. We do anticipate that the final rule will be published fairly soon. And the EPA has also indicated a more widespread rulemaking on the Clean Water Act will be forthcoming as well. So we're keeping an eye out for that one. On water quality, the EPA published a proposed rule of revising the 2020 Clean Water Act, Section 401 Water Quality Certification Rule. That was a Trump administration rule as well that has been subsequently vacated by a federal court. And basically the new rule, the proposed rule, will strengthen the authority of states and tribes to protect their water resources and to align with national objectives outlined in one of the initial Biden executive orders, protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. The comment period on that proposed rule closed on August 9th, 2022. And again, we expect a final rule here to be published fairly soon, and we will track that. Next slide. Finally, there's been a bunch of activity on the Endangered Species Act over the past summer. NOAA and the Fish and Wildlife Service published two final rules, one in June, one in July, that revise or rescind several Endangered Species Act regulations from the Trump administration, including eliminating the new regulatory definition of critical habitat and rescinding the new rule for basically the process for excluding critical habitat and the exclusion analysis, and returning those to the previous version. And in addition, on July 5th of this summer, a federal court in the Ninth Circuit vacated the Trump era rules on interagency consultation under Section 7 of the Act and the blanket 4D take prohibition and other protections to threatened species. The Fish and Wildlife and NOAA had already announced their intention to rewrite these Trump era rules. So we will be tracking those as those are published. Next slide. Finally, back to environmental rule review and NEPA. CEQ did announce with the 2022 final rule that there will be a phase 2 rulemaking that will be promulgated sometime soon that will follow, and it will revise or eliminate other aspects of the 2021 final rule not addressed by the 2020 rule, which may include, as you see here, time limits for environmental assessments and environmental impact statements, public participation for environmental impact statements, and the rules pertaining to whether an action is categorically excluded. And so we will track those as they come online. And in addition, the CEQ had published a interim June 2020 final rule extending the deadline by 2 years for federal agencies to develop or revise proposed procedures for implementing the final July 2020 rule. And we will track those agency rules as they are promulgated. Next slide, please. And then moving to policy tracking for some of the state hydropower content, we did make a content update for the Vermont Certificate of Public Good page to reflect changes in Vermont's net metering thresholds, which include small hydropower net meter projects, when a developer is attempting to obtain a certificate of public good for the operation of those projects. We have a couple potential content updates. We do have a New York water quality rulemaking to change water quality standards. We have been tracking that for some time, and we are hopeful that we will see some progress on it here in the next year. In addition to this, Oregon water rights rule for the conversion of a hydroelectric water right to an in-stream water right for purposes of dam removal. So those are the main state content that we are tracking. And I believe that's it for the policy tracking updates. And with that, I will turn it back over to Aaron.
Great, thanks Jesse for that update. I also wanted to just quickly go through a few additional updates outside of the hydropower realm that we are focused on within the Rapid Toolkit. So one that we're really excited about and that should be completed very soon, hopefully by the end of the month, is an expansion of our transmission Rapid Toolkit to Puerto Rico. We've been working with the Department of Energy and the Puerto Rican Governor's Office for some time now to implement the addition of Puerto Rico, particularly with the devastating hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico and the continuing effort to rebuild their transmission and distribution grid. We felt that this would be very helpful. The Puerto Rico Governor's Office agreed, and they've been working with us. This will include transmission and distribution line processes, as well as their interaction with any applicable federal processes. We are currently targeting a end of FY22, end of September release date for this. And so, as mentioned, we're in final review on this material. It'll be going live hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and then DOE will be issuing a press release with the Puerto Rico Governor's Office. To be on the lookout for that. Next slide. We also, in FY22, have been completing a comprehensive update to our geothermal rapid pages. Geothermal was our original technology, predating rapid as the geothermal regulatory roadmap. A number of these pages, particularly on the federal side, where they were applicable to other technologies, had been updated and reviewed numerous times, but there were some pages that were geothermal specific that hadn't been reviewed for a number of years at both the federal and state level. And so as part of this, we're doing an overhaul of the geothermal specific federal leasing and permitting pages. These include leasing process through the Bureau of Land Management, exploration processes through both Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, as well as the drilling and utilization or power plant development processes that are administered by the BLM. And then we're also doing this for 12 states with geothermal specific leasing and permitting information, which includes Alaska, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Texas, Utah, and Washington. And so we're in process of this now. Also aiming to be completed by the end of FY22. Some of this might bleed into early FY23, but this is another update that I wanted to call folks' attention to if they do work across different technologies, whether that's on the consulting, regulatory, or policy side of things. So be on the lookout for those updates as well. And next slide. And then finally, I wanted to go over something that I do think is directly applicable to a lot of our hydropower stakeholders, something I want to call their attention to. The Department of Energy's Office of Electricity, which that division of the Office of Electricity has now moved into the Grid Deployment Office within the new Infrastructure Directorate that Secretary Granholm has stood up. They have funded the addition of Clean Water Act, Section 401 water quality certification information, and the National Pollution Discharge Program construction stormwater permits for all 50 states. And so these can be applicable across technologies, and those of you that are familiar with hydropower certainly are aware that there are 401 requirements, either being 401 issued or waived as a precondition to receiving a FERC license, and FERC being able to issue that license. And so we're really excited about the ability to expand our 401 certification information and construction stormwater discharges to all 50 states. This is something that we currently have about half of the states on the Rapid Toolkit, including this information. And then over the course of probably the next 6 months, we'll be adding this information for other states. We are, keeping track of the progress of the federal rulemaking on water quality. from all that we have seen, it appears that rulemaking is going to put the state's authority around water quality certifications more in line with what predated the Trump rule under the previous 401 rule. But we'll be tracking that closely to see if it's going to have any sort of ripple effect on state 401 processes as well. Next slide. And so with that covers our portion today, focused on the Rapid Toolkit updates that we've made and an overview of the toolkit. At this time, we did want to open it up to any questions that folks had on either what we've covered today or other things that might be on their mind. We also wanted to open this up as an opportunity for people to provide feedback to us on what they think would be helpful to add to the Rapid Toolkit in future iterations. So we have constant dialogue with the Department of Energy as the owner, so to speak, of the tool. NREL provides the staff to maintain and update the tool. And so this is always something that we're very interested to hear from users of the tool themselves in terms of what information is either helpful now or would be helpful to add and include within the toolkit. So with that, we'll turn it over to our audience for any questions or feedback. And then Ryan, is everybody on mute, or do they need to type in the chat, or do they have the option to speak?
They can type in the chat, or if anyone wants to speak, they can raise their hand and I will unmute them.
Great. So if we have anyone that wants to raise their hand, let us know. Otherwise, feel free to type anything into the chat box over anything we've covered today or anything of interest to you involving the Rapid Toolkit. Like we see one hand up, Ryan.
Yep, go ahead, Frankie.
Thanks. Hi, Aaron. It's Frankie, Wildlife Service. And I just wanted to thank you for making this Rapid Toolkit available. When you showed us the stats on how much use it gets, is there any kind of intention to would it potentially go away? Or is that just something you're just using just to keep track? Or I didn't know if there was any intention.
Yeah, we generally so we don't envision the Rapid Toolkit going away, and we have funding secured for future updates. It's more that we've gotten that question a number of times from users or those like yourself, Frankie, who have helped kind of inform the Rapid Toolkit over the years in terms of well, how many people are using it and how frequently is that occurring. And so we do try to provide just this high-level snapshot of some of those stats on usage and downloads of our publications is something that we've included in these webinars. But that's really more of an FYI for others to be aware of.
Okay, good to know. Just it's come up in some internal conversations about the hydrovisioning. Anyway, I didn't know how much you were involved with that, and just kind of like looking at tools available to applicants. It's a really useful tool especially for those applicants who are not very familiar with the FERC process and any kind of state related laws associated with FERC licensing. So, and the other thing, I just wanted to commend your flow charts that are available through the Rapid Toolkit are very, very useful. Several of us have found them and used them and shared them. So please don't ever take those away, because they're better than the ones on the FERC website these days.
Well, thank you, Frankie. It's actually something when we've been developing this Puerto Rico effort that they were most excited about, because it is nice to see that kind of bird's eye view and that snapshot of, you know, the steps that are involved, and then you can dive in deeper. But if you start at that deeper point, sometimes it's overwhelming to really navigate what is all going to be required to get through a permitting or regulatory process. So we appreciate that, and certainly appreciate, Frankie, all the support that you've helped over the years with this. On the vision study front, you know, I have been involved a little bit with the road mapping effort. You know, I feel like that's kind of gone back and forth between visionaries and then these road mapping working groups. And so I haven't spent as much time on it this summer, but I do plan to re-engage this fall and winter as that effort continues on. So I'm glad to know that you know, part of that discussion is the tools. Another thing on that front that I would mention, we have been in talks with the Water Power Office about trying to find a way to create some linkages between Oak Ridge's environmental decision support tool and the Rapid Toolkit, namely trying to be able to navigate through that in terms of, you know, identifying impacts, identifying relevant studies to understand those impacts, and then based off of the results of those studies, what permitting and regulatory requirements might come out of those results. And so that is a linkage that we're trying to work with WPTO on to get funding for as part of a new phase of environmental decision support, to really then provide some of those outputs around what type of permits and regulations do you have to comply with based off the results of studies and site-specific impacts.
Aaron, we do have one question in the Q&A here. Two-part question. One, are there any plans for integration with ArcGIS systems? And two, who provided funding for the creation of the toolkit?
Yeah, excellent question. So on the first question, this is something that I've struggled with a bit over the years. Within the toolkit, we do include a lot of references and resources for where someone could obtain some of this GIS information. We do not directly have any plans to use ArcGIS or host GIS information within the Rapid Toolkit. We have a number of other tools at NREL around solar, geothermal, and wind, both at the US and international level, that are GIS tools that include various data layers on both resource potential and then in some cases, you know, land use ownership, environmental conditions. We also know there's a number of other tools out there within both the federal system and provided by NGOs that provide similar information. So we have a number of those referenced and linked within the toolkit itself, but we generally point users to those tools to obtain some of that information that's helpful to understanding what permits and regulations might be applicable. To the second part of that question in terms of funding, so funding for the tool has been provided by the U.S. Department of Energy, and they're technically the owner of the Rapid Toolkit, so to speak, in that regard. Their name is the one on the banner. That funding has come from a number of offices. Most notably, that funding has been provided from EERE, so the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy and sub-programs within that office, as well as what was the Office of Electricity staff that have now migrated into the Grid Deployment Office. And so those have been the two primary funding sources of the Rapid Toolkit over the course of its existence. Any other questions or thoughts on what might be helpful for future expansions to the Rapid Toolkit, or any other feedback?
Michael Carroll, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I'm with Helios Altus Corp, and we generally make smaller systems Many of them are sort of the 500 watt, 1 kilowatt, 5 kilowatt range that people are interested in using on their own properties and things. And so I guess what will be helpful for us is a clearer way of, I guess, defining in a state or area where they can where they can use it. It's sort of a cumbersome for somebody on something that size trying to go through all of the questions, and I know there's size limits in terms of like if you're below a certain kilowatt, you're a lot of the regulatory things don't apply. So I guess for us anyway, something along that line would be great.
Great. And out of curiosity, so these projects, are these kind of in piping systems? Are they on open waterways? What does that look like?
Some are in pipe, some are always in conduit, so in canals, waterways, or like smaller creeks and rivers, things like that.
Okay. Yeah, and so I would encourage you to look at the energy recovery hydropower paper that we have on there. I think there have been some changes made to that process, and we do also maintain a qualifying conduit exemption page within our FERC authorizations. But well noted that these micro hydropower projects certainly generally have different requirements than small hydropower or more larger conventional hydropower projects. So thanks for the input.
Yeah. Thank you. Yep, you're welcome.
Ryan, anything else in the chat?
Not that I'm seeing.
Okay. Can we actually go back to that previous slide? So I did want to at least flag this for everyone. My contact information, you can reach me at aaron.levine@nrel.gov, or my colleague Taylor Curtis, who has been heavily involved as one of the lead analysts over the number of years for the Rapid Toolkit and lead author on some of our best practice papers at taylor.curtis@nrel.gov. If you have any additional input or follow on you want to provide us, feel free to reach out. We also do, on the Rapid Toolkit itself, have the ability to contact us and provide feedback that way if you aren't capturing our emails today. But if we don't have any other questions or comments, we can go ahead and wrap up a little early today. Again, thanks everyone for attending. We'll continue to track and monitor these updates and update our pages accordingly. And it's good to see a lot of users continuing to come to the Rapid Toolkit to look for this information. So with that, thanks to everyone, and we'll be in touch.